Sharon, it's so good to have you. I'm so excited that you're here. Thanks for accepting my invitation.
Thank you for having me.
Since 1991, you've been coming and going to Armenia, but these past couple of years have been particularly special because you've been coming as a Fulbright Scholar to conduct research here in Armenia, all the while still practicing as a medical doctor in emergency medicine and also as an associate professor at Yale University. So I consider you my Wonder Woman. And I'm not even touching the tip of the iceberg of all the things that you've accomplished so far. Tell me what this Fulbright project is about.
So the Fulbright project has been a wonderful opportunity to bring together a lot of things that I've been doing over the years since I started traveling to Armenia and since I became a medical doctor. I've really done several projects here, one in emergency medical services and how to improve them, another in CPR, another in traffic safety, and most recently I became very involved with the stroke group here in Armenia and that cooperates with the diasporan physicians, mostly neurologists. And they had asked me if I would represent emergency medicine and try and make some optimizations or linkages between emergency medicine and stroke care here in Armenia, which is quite advanced now because of this group. When I was working with them, I realized that what really needs to happen is that emergency medicine needs to advance, and emergency medicine education in particular needs to occur, because right now in emergency medicine in Armenia, there's very little hospital-based care, which is okay. We have a huge advantage. We have physicians on the ambulances here, but none of them are trained in emergency medicine, and this is really a relatively new specialty around the world, and you can see in different places that it's in different stages of development. So Armenia is in that stage where we're just starting the recognition of the specialty. We're writing a curriculum for physicians that are already practicing, and we're writing a curriculum for those that will be trained exclusively in emergency medicine. And this is really the subject of my Fulbright right now, in addition to doing some research work looking at the database from emergency medical services and the ambulance system, and really writing some descriptive pieces about what's going on here so that people can start to understand and work on some of the problems we have.
Are you supposed to also provide like some action plan or a roadmap of what the next 5 years should look like, for instance, short, medium term? What solutions are you proposing any solutions?
Yes, so the stroke group that I work with has actually been uniquely successful because they have written a roadmap between diasporan doctors and Armenian doctors about how they want stroke care to develop in Armenia, and importantly how they want to have it financed, because a lot of care depends on financing from the ministry, as you can imagine. And so we want to do the same thing in emergency care, really state where we're at and then show where we want to go and then do all of the steps in between. And it's going to take a really big group of people. So I don't want to say I'm doing that alone because I have a map I think I showed you at one time of all the people involved in contributing to different parts of emergency care and disaster preparedness as well.
Yeah, because I'm thinking traffic safety, for instance, obviously, is you're not dealing only with the Ministry of Health. I'm assuming emergency also situations, also traffic control. I mean, it's a big deal. So, I mean, how do you consolidate or work or collaborate with all these different institutions to make sure that your roadmap eventually, not yours, but even the country's roadmap would be implemented or successful?
I think at this stage, I'm trying to understand who the stakeholders are. And over the course of the last 2 years, I've really been able to do that. And so we have a wonderful group that's coming together. My hope is that we'll meet regularly and start to chip away at all of the problems and issues that you see. But you're right, down to the engineers for the city, for crosswalks, down to the pharmacists that work with emergency services to order proper drugs that we need to respond in emergencies. All of these things take a lot of coordination and a lot of people and a lot of dedication and understanding of how important it is. And I think COVID and also the war that we've had in 2020 and the smaller wars that have occurred since then have really helped to bring emergency services, emergency medicine, and disaster preparedness into the consciousness of Armenian people.
You see that happening?
I do see that, yeah. I do see that.
medicine wasn't always necessarily a field of yours. You started off at Wellesley College, I think it was liberal arts college, in French literature. And I raise this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I raise the story because I actually appreciate people who conduct or identify professions that are true to their heart. And you're an example of that. You don't have to stick to one particular profession, that you actually chip away until you know what's true to you. What message would you give to high school students, or anyone for that matter, you know, when they're probably confused as to what their future should be, or if they're midway through their careers and they want to go through a transition? What message would you give to them?
Well, I graduated from Smith College, and I studied actually French literature and economics, so two completely different things. And nobody could understand how they meshed together exactly. But they were, because, you know, I love both of those subjects, and so I think that was the most important thing. I've used French maybe twice during my career as a physician, but it's, you know, it doesn't diminish the studies and the importance of doing what you love to do. So I would say do that first, you know, choose what you love and the rest will follow. Economics, I still, you know, people think economics and they think you have to work in a bank, but I was much more interested in that human side of economics, the more micro side, where you understand behavior, decisions, and those are all things that come into my daily work and come into, I think, understanding how systems work, how emergency systems work, how patients make decisions. So those things are still very present in what I do.
Right. Also in public health, because you also had a master's degree in public health, so I'm assuming a lot of that administrative aspect of organizational development and behaviorism comes into play with your background in economics as well. So it's not a bad thing to have a variety of different hats you're wearing at the same time, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I actually worked, you're right, I worked in fragrance development for Chanel, was one of the first projects I worked on. So we worked on picking the fragrance, choosing the name, and then working with focus groups. And asking customers, salespeople, everybody that would interact with this fragrance, how they felt, what decisions they would make. And so those same skills really did transfer into public health projects when I decided to shift my work. And I worked in northern Manhattan on an immunization project. So very similar, you know, why were parents not taking their kids to be vaccinated? What were the issues in terms of migration between different countries, different cities, all of these sort of the nitty-gritty of things. I love that.
So I look at you, you're in a highly competitive field. You're a woman, you're an Armenian, and these past 5-10 years, if not more, there have been numerous articles published in peer-reviewed scholarly journals, or even popular management journals like HBR or MIT Sloan, about diversity and inclusion. In your field, or in general in life, have you faced challenges related to inclusivity, given your background? And if you have had, how did you deal with them?
No, I can't say. Maybe I just put blinders on, but I just do what I want to do, and it seems to work out. Yeah.
So you're so far smooth sailing.
So far smooth sailing.
Well, you can be considered one of the lucky ones, I guess, right?
I mean, I have to say at Smith, you know, everybody's a woman, so there are no issues with leadership being exclusively male. So maybe that helped in some way. Okay,
good. I had the privilege of meeting you for the first time in person when I had interviewed your father, Lara Tcholakian, last year. And the first impression I had of you was this person who really cared for elders, especially her father, her aunt Hermine. What does your father represent? What meaning and what does he mean for you, your father, Lara Chekijian? What does he represent?
Yes, he's certainly foundational in everything that I've done. You know, the stories he tells, those are my stories too. Family, I think, is very important to all of us in our family. We really like each other, and that's helpful. I think people look from the outside and they think, oh, we spend so much time together, and but we're really very bonded. We love to travel together. We love to share experiences together, and I think, you know, those fundamental values that they impart certainly stay with me in my daily life.
Well, obviously, I mean, I see that there's a quote I read, I think it was saying that character is more important than reputation. You do have that humility in you, and you tend to really put forward the importance of your father more than, let's say, the person or the persona that you represent as a role of being a medical doctor or a researcher, a scholar, a professor. So that I find that that's where do you get those values from?
I mean, I suppose I get it from my family. This reverence for other members of the family. Like I said, we really like each other, so I think that makes it easier.
Again, very lucky.
Very lucky. I mean, I've always had the attitude that my friends are, the friends of my whole family, and they really enjoy my friend circle because of that. And sometimes they forget that they're more my friends than their friends, and it's really cute. They have their separate relationships. For instance, yeah, when my father traveled to Armenia after my uncle had passed, he very often would be at dinner with friends of mine, or going to the theater, or going to see films, different screenings, and people really took care of him, and I really appreciated that as well.
Well, I think of your family, and I'm thinking of your childhood as well. You grew up obviously in the Boston area with a few years in California. Your father was an immigrant from Jerusalem, so he was doing whatever he could to really integrate and make succeed in his profession in this new country in the United States. So you weren't able to see him often because he was either traveling, he was absent, really trying to make something for himself and for his family. So your real connection to Armenianness was either your family, your extended family, Saturday school, some events in the community, but that was about it. So there was no enforcement that you had to speak Armenian or whatever. Yet in your third year of college, you decide on your own to visit Armenia. And I say 1991, before independence. So this was during the Soviet regime. Where did this idea come from for a person who wasn't necessarily, ingrained to have Armenia as part of their future destination? Where did this idea come from? And tell me about that first experience.
Sure. So you're right. My sense of being Armenian was mostly a familial sense of being Armenian, not really a sense of, nationalism. I didn't grow up with AYF, although my dad certainly did, and I'm sure that gave him a sense of purpose towards the country. But in 1991, I suppose I just wanted to come and learn a new language, honestly. I loved languages so much. And there was a summer language program with HBU and with Kevork Bardakjian, professor of Armenian language at University of Michigan. And it was a really unusual program because it was 3 months long. At that time, actually, you could not visit the Soviet Union without an official invitation of some sort. So I suppose it was also a guise to travel because I had been in Paris the year preceding that summer. And I really didn't want to go back home. I wanted to keep on traveling. I enjoyed that. I enjoyed learning about languages and about other people. And so I just continued my journey, essentially, traveling, further east. And I had met somebody at Smith, actually, from Armenia. She was the only person that I knew here. And so I decided to come. It was a very odd time. We lived in a dormitory where we were asked to live because we were staying for more than 1 month. And so we were all under the control at that point of Soviet authorities, I suppose. I think they were listening in. They were, they knew where we were going, where we weren't going. People with family here in Armenia weren't allowed to stay with them. They could go for dinner, but they couldn't stay overnight at somebody else's home. So it was a very odd time. And then we learned Western Armenian in the middle of a country speaking Eastern Armenian. So this was also kind of strange. So in addition to learning how to speak, I would go out and there would be a totally different language. So grappling with those two different languages dialects was also very interesting. And they're quite different, as you know.
And so that basically was the first step for you to actually visit. Then you started coming after that, even with land and culture.
I did. It was a very dramatic time. So it was the first Artsakh War, Karabakh War at that time. I met a group from Land and Culture during that trip. And I decided that I would come back and do Land and Culture at some point, which I eventually did in 1995. And so, I landed back in France, in Europe, and the coup on the Kremlin had happened actually while we were in flight.
You, I think of you, and I'm always thinking of this one terminology that you have, which is collective future. This is what I'm coining what you said. Or repeating what you said. And here you're always thinking about never looking backwards, always looking to the future. What are the things that we can do or we should do in each of our own field to help improve, whether it's capacity building, knowledge sharing, education, etc., in Armenia. Yet in 2011, you decide to go to Turkey to visit your ancestral birthplace in Zeytun and Marash. And you went not just the first one time, you went actually a few times, 3 times in fact, every year after that. So 2011, you visit your grandmother's, I guess, birthplace. Mariam Chobanyan was her name. Zumrut Norashkharian was her original name. And you actually, for a person who thinks about the future, you also went to visit places where there's a specific meaning, spiritual meaning for you. So tell me what it means, what meaning has your inherited legacy, or what meaning have your ancestral narratives or stories brought to you in your life, philosophically, spiritually, and why is it important to look towards the future?
So you're right, I've always thought more about country building, especially because of the time that I was first in Armenia and that idea that we were a nascent nation. I traveled back in 2011, and I did go to Galicia. The following year, I went to the remaining parts of Turkey, and I was able to visit Zeytun and Marash, where my grandparents were from. And that really brought things to life. So I think up until then, I didn't understand what had happened, I think, in their lives up until that point. And I became very interested in that. And you had mentioned shifting careers. And, my first job actually out of college was reading scripts. And so I had this I love stories, as you do. I had this story sort of playing in my mind that I sometime wanted to make a documentary. And so while we were traveling, we went to Ani. And on the way to Ani, man named Steve Sim got on our bus to come with us, and he's really the foremost, I won't say scholar because he's not an academic, but he is a scholar of Ani. And he first traveled to Ani when it was in that no man's land between Armenia and Turkey, and he was kind of a poor architecture student doing his grand tour. And when he landed, he had one book that he had bought because he didn't have a lot of funds. So he bought one volume of Robert's Travel Guide to Armenia that was printed, I think, in 1923. I might be wrong about that. And it was the second volume. So it was like the easternmost parts of Turkey, which were, of course, all Armenian. And he got there and realized that, wow, where were the people behind this? He actually had no idea about the politics of the time and genocide. He really didn't. And he went back and he read all about that. So we met him, and I said, oh my God, this is an amazing subject for a documentary. This, Steve is just incredible. And Ani Hovanesian was on the trip with me fortuitously, and our dads.
This was your third time being in Turkey.
This was our second time. Well, we traveled both times together, but I think we met Steve the second time we were there. And Ani is a filmmaker, of course, and she's done an amazing job. We actually ended up going back in 2013 or 2014 and filming what we filmed and what became The Hidden Map, which is a project Ani worked on from the point we filmed until just this past year where it came out.
And you co-produced it.
I co-produced it, yes. I actually ended up filming parts of it because our cameraman became ill, so another job.
Another profession.
Yes. We ended up in a hospital in Mush, and our cameraman, Peter, who's a dear friend, said, you realize this is my worst nightmare, to be in a hospital in Mush, using Google Translate and me to figure out what was wrong. But in any case, I think it turned out very well, and we ended up capturing so many stories. You could make probably 50 films from the footage that we shot and from the stories that we heard. And so that became, to answer your question, that became a really important part of sort of my understanding of the inheritance.
And how to look forward would be, okay, what's done is done. We have to actually think about not to forget where we come from, but also how do you build from this point forward?
Yeah, I think the thing that I took away from it was really that need for security and safety, which is really, plays into emergency medicine. and disaster preparedness and that type of protecting of everything now, which we weren't able to do in Artsakh.
We talked about your father, but I think of other role models in your life. You had mentioned Caroline Najarian, even Dr. Ara Babloyan, even Kevork. Tell me, what imprint have these people, and also the doctor, I don't remember what his name was, the doctor in the US who had actually gone to Russia or Moscow.
Oh, Jim Muller, yes,
right,
our neighbor when I was young.
Right. So these people have actually had an imprint in your life. Tell me about that. Tell me what was special about them and what lessons you've learned from them.
Yeah, I think everyone was special in their own way. Jim Muller had traveled to Russia at a time where people didn't travel to Russia. And I certainly became curious about what was behind the Iron Curtain, which I think maybe most people would shy away from that and they wouldn't want to go, but I really wanted to understand that. And I remember all the stories from childhood, but he was also a doctor. And so that really impacted, I think, the earlier parts of my childhood, because I did hear stories about patients and about, being in the hospital. And I think I carried those forward with me. Of course, my aunt was a nurse, and so I'm sure she also told me stories that lasted and sort of, entered my subconscious. Caroline Najarian is somebody who went back to school rather, later in life. And so she was a role model to me because she showed me that you can change your career if you want to. And she came and worked very hard after the earthquake. And so I interacted with her here and in Boston and understood some of her work. And Ara Babloyan was actually the Minister of Health when I did my thesis for medical school. And organ transplantation, yeah, he was one of the only ones doing living-related kidney transplants at the time. And so really a pioneer here in Armenia. And so we looked at all aspects of transplantation, the general population's perception, doctors' perceptions of doing it. The church wrote a statement on brain death. We introduced a bill in the National Assembly here, or a law stipulating what brain death meant. So I worked on all those different, again, bringing in all those various nitty-gritty aspects of what it takes to get a project done. And Dr. Babloyan was wonderful at shepherding me through that and has continued to be an incredible role model here in Armenia, as he's done amazing things, in the hospitals and with advancing care for children.
You, I just see you, I never hear anything negative coming out of your mouth. You're always very, very optimistic, very positive, despite the fact that Armenia and Artsakh have been hit with so many challenges, and not just historically, but even recent. Do you not see, do you never get angry or upset? Do you never, just, think about, that's it, all this work and effort, of coming and going and working on different projects, whether it's with the ministry or the National Institute for, anyhow, I mean, do you never get tired or exhausted or frustrated?
Oh, sure, we all do, I think. This last war, those 2 days were, a crisis, a real crisis, existential for all of us. Yeah.
Yet you still think you have to keep looking forward. I just have to keep clutching away and do whatever I can, what it takes to actually bring in my 2 cents for the betterment of the nation building process, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you saw that sort of national mood that happened, around September 13th and 14th. Everybody had this sort of dip in morale or this existential crisis, and then everybody sort of lifted themselves out of that, and we continued to work. Even a week or 2 weeks later, everybody was back at work and back at building, and I think, that's what we've all done many times, this sort of collapse, rebuilding, collapse, rebuilding.
And so what message do you give yourself to wake up in the morning and say, I have to keep working, I have to keep fighting, I have to keep building? What do you tell yourself to?
Well, I mean, I do work hard to sort of eliminate perceived obstacles. I think that's like a very conscious thing that I do. I try to say, okay, what's holding me back from doing this or doing that, or what's holding somebody else back from doing it? And I try to really move past that. So maybe it's really much more conscious than I think. But in this case, I guess, what do we have to lose? We have to move forward.
Okay. Sharon Chekijian, thank you so much for your time and for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
Thanks, Sharon.